Hi there guys, and welcome to every episode of Family Guy Season 17 Reviewed. Season 16 of this show was surprising in how unconforming it was. It was also an okay season quality wise, which was a bonus. Let's hope this season continues in somewhat of the same vein. As ever, if you are enjoying this series, or just enjoying the channel in general, please consider leaving a like and subscribe. So with that reminder out of the way, I'm going to get straight into the episodes. Season 17. That's the only time I'll do that this video, you get the point. Episode 1, Married with Cancer. Brian falls for a girl named Jess. He soon finds out she has terminal cancer, so decides to get married to her before she passes. However, at the wedding, they are told that her cancer is cured. My best cutaway was crazier than whatever Kanye West is doing at this exact moment. And my best moment was Peter failing to throw a boomerang. The season opener gets a 2 out of 5. This episode reuses numerous plot points from previous episodes. I mean, Brian getting into a relationship by pretending to be a nice guy, only to regret it later on, must have happened a dozen times on the show. Even the scene at dinner where the family are dicks about Jess having cancer is reminiscent of how they treated the older woman who Brian dated. They tried to spice it up a little, with the twist about her actually surviving her terminal diagnosis, so Brian had to stay married to her for the long term. But this rather predictably ended up with her becoming as annoying as possible, at least from Brian's perspective. Then she actually does die from choking, only again not really, because she rises up to disappoint Brian once more at her own funeral. None of this made any real sense, and I ended up feeling disconnected with all of the characters here. At least there were a few jokes I found decent. I mean, Kanye massaging a lasagna while announcing he's joining ISIS would only be about the 20th craziest thing he's ever done. And Peter somehow launching himself instead of a boomerang was exactly the type of physics-defying nonsense we all expect from him. Still a disappointing start to the season. Episode 2, Dead Dog Walking. Brian and Jess continue their strained marriage. Meanwhile, Stewie and Chris get hooked on vaping. My best cutaway was Chris trying to stay off the spying government's grid, and Quagmire chasing the ring girl was my best moment. I gave this one a 3 out of 5. So this starts off letting us know with a fourth rule breaking narrator that this will indeed be a follow-up to the previous episode, and the story between Brian and Jess continues not to impress. After some scenes showing how excruciating their relationship is from both sides, Jess secretly tries to have Brian euthanized. Peter, after rushing to learn the definition of the word, ends up saving Brian. Then Brian and Jess have an argument, where Jess tries to argue she did it because Brian let her die before. Finally they settle with the horrible conclusion that they are meant to be together because they want to kill each other. Not that it matters at all, because right after, Jess is finally killed for good, off screen. Do you see how little any of this mattered yet? Not only that, it was quite a chore to sit through their debacle of a relationship. I am glad Jess is gone for good now, in all honesty. The side plot with Chris and Stewie vaping was okay at least. It had a few memorable moments. Lem accidentally making out was maybe not such a great one, but I did like Quagmire, or rather Crabmire, scaring the ring girl. I also liked how Chris was right about the government tracking him, and Brian saying the internet will freak out if you kill me. That was pretty on point. You might as well joke about that whole thing now. There's also Brian singing Michigan J Frog. That was a reference I liked. In general, it was the jokes which got this to a 3. Episode 3, Pal Stewie. Stewie makes a new friend called Hudson, but gets burned by not getting an invite to his birthday party. My favourite cutaway was a celebrity interruption on Saturday Night Live. And my best moment was just Stewie hanging out with Hudson. I gave this one a 3 out of 5. This ended up being a very disappointing 3 because I liked the majority of the main plot very much. Stewie finding a new kid friend who is genuinely just nice and friendly to him was good to see. Stewie deserves to just have some fun as a baby from time to time, you know? I don't think it takes anything away from his edge or evil side. My favourite moments here were just him playing around with Hudson, especially the bit where Hudson gives Stewie his toy and Stewie gives Hudson his, only for them both to immediately choke on them. The ending was the main reason I didn't really love this episode. Stewie thinks that Hudson snubbed him by not sending him an invite for his party, and goes to mess it up as revenge. However, Brian comes in to reveal that he actually threw Stewie's invite away because he was scared of losing him as a friend. Stewie wasn't even mad at him, instead saying they are family and closer than friends. Not only was this not an original plot point, I did not think this was necessary. I already know that Stewie and Brian care about each other. I don't need to be sold on that anymore, especially not by butting into a totally unrelated story right at the end. I would rather Stewie make up with Hudson, but no, he walks off with Brian. It was a shame in my opinion. I would honestly not have minded Hudson becoming a recurring character as a companion for Stewie. Oh well. The Peter subplot I just could not get into. So that, along with not the funniest jokes, lower this rating even more. However, I do have to give credit to the jab at SNL, at the whole celebrity catching the actor, bad-mouthing them. That sketch is so corny and contrived, so seeing everyone go crazy over it was funny by itself. Quagmire crashing his plane into the house sold the joke even more. Episode 4. Big Trouble in Little Quahog. Brian and Stewie are shrunk by Stewie's new invention and must find a way to survive. The best out of a mediocre list of 4 cutaways was how the exterminator imagines a night with Peter, and my best moment was the ending action sequence. I gave this one a 4 out of 5. This was another idea based off Stewie creating another gadget, this time being able to shrink people, and the way they inevitably got shrunk is because Stewie wanted to get back at Brian for making fun of his height. This worked mainly because I liked their experiences being so tiny. Their size may have been a bit inconsistent at times. I mean, at one moment they're the size of a rat, the other the size of a water bear. But I'm fine with them bending the rules if it allows them to pack in some fun moments, like having to fight off the rat and being swept up by the vacuum cleaner. Yes, there were a few graphic moments, like Stewie impaling the rat and Stewie and Brian getting stuck in Cleveland's snot. Still, these are outnumbered by the nice visuals. The bits with the water bears in their world, as well as the ending escape, was all very well animated, and the colour choices were very good. Honestly, the look of this episode gave me slight Rick and Morty vibes, which is not a bad thing, especially as a one-off. Tiny Tom Cruise saving the day was a bit meh, but still, I can forgive it when the rest of the story was entertaining. Episode 5. Regarding Carter. After Carter gives Lois a gun, she accidentally shoots him with it, putting him in a coma. After he recovers, he turns over a new leaf. My best cutaway was Peter turning himself into 100% stained glass, and my best moment was Chris singing Alone by Heart on The Voice. I gave this one a 4 out of 5. This ended up being enjoyable, mainly for a number of good jokes. Peter screwing around with Lois's gun at the start produced a number of funny moments, like Peter acting as the gun range target, and him threatening the judge on The Voice. Peter was in the right on that one though. How dare that judge not recognise Chris's amazing talent. Even the scene where Lois accidentally shoots Carter was somewhat funny, mimicking the zoom out, which movies often do. Now Carter becoming a new man was fine, mainly for a bit at the end, where he and Lois are actually able to enjoy some time together. Even Peter realizes that maybe money isn't everything, once he sees how happy the new Carter seems to be compared to the old one. Of course, Carter goes back to normal in the end, once a conveniently absent Babs finally shows up to shoot him again. Wasn't crazy about that, but whatever. I can just about let it slide. Other good cutaways here include Shaquille O'Neal getting stuck in a restaurant booth. I like how his tone of voice doesn't change. There is also the nice visual of Peter as pure stained glass. Indeed, the sunlight shining on him does look very pretty. However, in a obscure reference, which most of you probably won't get, it reminded me of the first boss in Medieval, a nice little PS1 game from back in the day. Episode 6, Stand by Meg. After Meg saves Stewie from choking to death, Stewie attempts to make her life better. My best cutaway was Peter as the narrator for the Deschanel perfume ad. And my best moment was Peter's open-legged method of persuasion. This one gets a 3 out of 5. This was solid, quite close to a 4, but I didn't find it quite as funny as the previous 2 episodes. Meg saving Stewie's life, causing him to appreciate her more and want to help her out in life, was nice to see. They weren't that successful at it, especially with that restaurant debacle, but they did manage to get her a date with Kevin. That was a bit of a throwback to the early seasons, where Meg did actually have the hots for him. Here though, Kevin is too much of a psycho, so Meg dumps him. She seemed happy enough, actually being in a position to dump someone for once, so it's all good I suppose. Chris getting in with a bunch of Italians was okay, but not as meaningful as the other plot. The main thing I liked about it was all the Goodfella references. In terms of the jokes, I did like the perfume advert, especially the lines, hot but not worth it, and probably a nightmare in person. And as I said, Peter's rather disturbing flash to Principal Shepard and Dr. Hartman worked because it's one of those ones that's more disturbing to them than us, the viewer. Episode 7, Griffin Winter Games. Meg successfully manages to get onto the US Winter Olympic team. However, things take a turn when Peter ends up on the wrong side of North Korea. My best cutaway was Stewie trying to help a skater get their tights over their thighs. And best overall moment was Peter and Meg's old video game-esque escape from the North Korean prison. This one gets a 3 out of 5. This was interesting from a writing standpoint because they threw away any kind of normal episode structure completely out the window. They got into the main story about Meg fairly quickly, but once we actually got to the ski competition, they never kept the focus there, instead dipping into numerous different plot lines, like Stewie with this woman and her fake gay friend, and Peter's conflicts with North Korea. At least the Peter stuff linked back into Meg's plot when she gave up her chance at a medal by leaving her competition to save him. As I mentioned, I did enjoy that sequence where they escaped. It was a nice homage to the late 90s video games, maybe early 2000s as well, you know, those type of first-person shooter games. It was also kind of a nice moment between Meg and the family at the end. But let's be real, it wasn't really earned. Meg earned it, absolutely, but the rest of the family did nothing for her, but still got to jump on the bandwagon at the end. This again makes my point, that this was a bit weird for me, from a storytelling perspective. One positive of all this is that it allowed them to get very meta about the whole thing. For example, calling back to many famous moments from the show, and mentioning Meg's old voice actress. Not to mention the narrators, which often come in to goof things up. My favourite joke though, was Peter on the back of the Jeep, screaming about his balls. Overall, this was a very up and down episode, which manages to be on the higher end of a 3. Episode 8, Con Harris. Stewie discovers that Brian is trying to win the affections of a wealthy widow, and decides to help him out with the con. Meanwhile, Peter is mistaken for another chubby child by Herbert. My best cutaway here was the passive-aggressive alarm clock, and that was also my best moment. There really wasn't many to choose from, which maybe gives away the episode's rating of a 1 out of 5. This had a lot of the worst Family Guy traits present. The main plot had Brian, and indeed a lot of the main cast, being horrible, trying to scam an elderly woman out of her fortune. It made absolutely no sense the way it was presented, but the ending revelation that the old woman was Meg all along was even dumber. It's not worth trying to make sense of any of it, to be honest. And don't even get me started on the so-called joke about the stupidly long name. It took up almost 3 minutes in the episode, the 2 times it was used. Sometimes Family Guy gets away with these drawn out gags. This was not one of those occasions. The side plot was also a bit flat. We got to see Herbert in a big role for the first time in a while. Despite that, he came across a bit stale here. I know the character has always been a bit one note, but it's almost like the show has passed him by at this point. I don't have much to add. There was not much redeemable here. Episode 9, Pawtucket Pete. After Peter gets new bosses at work, he is soon made the mascot of the company. My best cutaway was Joe's fantasy about having his own show, and the best moment was Greg in the window. This one gets a 4 out of 5. To start off, I have to give a bit of credit to the funeral scene pre-intro. It had some of that Family Guy style humour, of course, but it was still sincere enough to work as a nice tribute to Carrie Fisher. Now the actual Bury stuff, where Angela gets replaced, I was not into at all. The new owners were just annoying. However, Peter's promotion to the mascot worked well, because it made sense. Peter is the kind of guy a beer company probably should be marketing to. Some of the bits of him acting as mascot were mildly entertaining, as was Brian replacing him as the mascot. It was a bit random, sure, but it worked for me just for Peter's attempt to assassinate the Brian balloon. It was so over the top that it worked. The main reason this scraped a 4 for me was the jokes. There is the Simpsons cutaway, with Mr. Burns calling Peter Homer, and Smithers just going, pretty much. The visual of the woman blowing up the Brian balloon was quite something, as was Joe imagining his own show. I like how bad his intro was, and how he adds, and also he can walk, at the end. I especially liked the bizarre meta joke about the guy in the window being the real main character. Like everything Peter does is just in service of this random guy looking out of his window. Maybe it's true as well, because it all came back to Greg for the ending. Episode 10, Hefty Shades of Grey. Peter learns the art of fake news and gets a job as Tom Tucker's co-anchor. Meanwhile, after Chris turns a hot girl down for a date, Brian wonders if he's gay. My best cutaway was Chris and the difficulty he had during his sugar addiction, and the best moment was Stewie getting possessed by the ghost. This one gets a 3 out of 5. This was a bit of a filler episode that is mainly there to set up the plotline for the next episode. There was still enough here to not make this a complete waste of time though. I like the ghost hunting bit at the start, and how it comes back later in the episode with Stewie randomly getting possessed by the ghost of this murdered woman. I like how Brian and Chris had no reaction to Stewie just floating away. As far as Peter goes, him getting white hair was quite cool. It looked good on him, I thought. Sure, him getting a job on the news, lying to people wasn't great, but again it sets up the next episode. Brian thinking Chris is gay brought up some good moments, and put into focus how overly reliant Chris is on porn, and some of Stewie's lines in the store I found quite funny. It looks like Chris's date Turned out to be a bit of a setup though. Sadly, we never got any resolution to this, which was a bit of a shame given all the setup. Anyway, on to the Trump episode. Episode 11, Trump Guy. Peter goes to work for Donald Trump's administration. However, he gets into a fight with him after Trump sexually assaults Meg. My best cutaway here was Peter buckling under pressure at a Billy Joel concert. And the best moment was Peter as the loudest guy on an overcrowded panel. This one gets a 1 out of 5. Above all else, the main reason this episode failed for me is that it was not at all witty or creative. It was just repeating the same tired jokes we have heard about Trump a million times before, even years before this episode aired. Like, we get it. Trump is a egomaniac, narcissist, goofy, fat, orange guy who has managed to get himself elected as the president of the US twice now. That's not even a knock at people who like Trump. Even all you Trump supporters out there surely have to concede those things about him. But this episode admitted to us that all they were doing was going through pointing out these things to us in a methodical manner. There was no real plot here, other than Trump grabbing Meg, causing Peter to get into a giant chicken style fight with him. It feels like to me they made this episode because they felt obligated to cover Trump as president, not because they had any actual ideas about how to creatively do it. A lot of shows fell into this trap around this time. The only funny moment I found really was Peter on the CNN panel, where he just randomly shouts out about not being able to get an erection. That's all I have to say about the content of this particular episode, but at this juncture, in order to give some kind of context to my opinions, not only about this episode, but also for any time in future where I might cover political satires, I do feel it's important and necessary to share where I'm coming from. Anyone who has watched quite a bit of this channel will probably have noticed whenever I'm forced to cover political things, I do so in a very standoffish, kind of dismissive manner. That is on purpose. It's a conscious choice I make. And the reason for that is, basically, I have long given up on mainstream politics. I myself don't vote. I don't get overly invested in the outcomes of elections or anything like that. And the reason for this is that I believe in most countries in the world, to varying extents, the US being a prime example, the whole system of government is corrupt and frankly evil by design. That's the crucial bit. Regardless of who gets in, the overall trajectory doesn't change, and people and their freedoms continue to get screwed over. Now sure, you can make the lesser of two evils argument, that's about all you can do. You can say that maybe this policy or that policy would be slightly better if this candidate got in over the other candidate. You know, the whole don't blame me, I voted for Kodos angle. And if you want to vote based on that, then fair enough. You know your life circumstances better than I do, but I personally don't play the lesser of two evils game. In my view, participating in the broken system only empowers it and keeps the whole cycle going. You're not going to vote your way out of trouble. We got into the position we're in now by complying with it after all. I just refuse to waste my energy on that. I'd much rather focus my energy on myself and the people I care about by trying to, improve the situation in any practical way I can. I'm certainly not waiting for any saviour to come along and make things better, because that's just not gonna happen. So yeah, that's my take on it. Again, just to be absolutely clear, I'm never going to judge anyone, regardless of who you vote for. But my general advice to everyone, regardless of where you happen to sit on the political spectrum, is try not to get so emotionally attached to it all. Like some people lose friendships and relationships over election results. I've heard stories of people getting divorced, and some people even killing themselves based on this stuff. And I'm really not making light of that, I'm really absolutely not. But I plead with people who are in this situation. Don't give your power away to the powers that be at the top, many of whom are literal psychopaths. You are worth it as an individual. You deserve much better than that. Just to clarify again, I'm not saying you shouldn't have passionate beliefs and opinions. I have some myself. I'm not trying to be some enlightened centrist here. I just guard against filtering it through the mainstream system, which is ultimately a clown show, like a Punch and Judy show. 90% of what goes on in the public domain of politics is just theatre anyway. So yeah, that's that. I hope I haven't offended anyone with what I've said here. Not at all my intention, but I understand my position is not a popular one. Whenever I discuss politics, I get it from both sides, believe me. Which is why I try not to talk about politics. But I feel I owe it to you guys to be honest and share my thoughts. If you want to discuss anything I've said here in more detail, please drop a comment, and I will happily have a respectful discussion about it. For now though, I'm moving on. Episode 12, Bry Robot. Brian worries about his legacy, so thinks about writing an autobiography. Stewie creates a robot duplicate of him to prove that nobody would want to read it. I have the same best cutaway and moment here, which was Joe being easily influenced by song lyrics. I gave this one a 2 out of 5. This was lackluster for the most part. To be honest, I can barely even remember the Peter side plot. Was it something about Peter and Joe, and a brothel, and a massage parlour? I'm not being facetious here. I genuinely forgot about it the second I finished watching the episode. It was that uneventful and meaningless. The only thing I can remember was the cutaway of Joe reacting to the lyrics, "I get knocked down, but I get up again." What really cracked me up was him going, "Yeah, good." Never change, Joe. Never change. Stewie creating this robot version of Brian was a bit creepy, especially the bit of Brian making out with him and apparently having his way with the robot. But this all plays into how much of a pretentious narcissist Brian is, which was kind of the point. Stewie did get Brian to experience what it was like being around himself, and I think it did somewhat sink into Brian what a jerk he can be. Is it going to change him long term though? Well, I think we all know the answer to that. Episode 13, Trans Fat. Peter gets misidentified as transgender, but goes along with it anyway for the perceived perks. He soon finds out that it's not so easy. My best cutaway was Peter winning socks on karate, and best moment overall was Peter missing all the exciting moments of the baseball game whenever he turns his back. I gave this one a 2 out of 5. Some of the Act 1 bits at the baseball game were decent, and to be fair, Peter taking advantage of being transgender is something you would expect him to do. As usual though, whenever the show covers this issue, many of the bits didn't make sense. Peter getting a sex change operation without his knowledge was very silly, and I'm sure many of the interactions he has with people as a transgender person are inaccurate to what actually goes down. All of this is meant to be justified by his conversation with Ida at the end. Peter is feeling down on himself, so Ida calls him out as a fraud, just pretending to be trans, before telling him some of the problems and mistreatment that trans people can actually experience. Now, I'm not trans, or a member of the LGBT community, so I don't feel I'm qualified to say how relevant or meaningful this is. But I know some people who watch this channel are members of the LGBT community, and maybe have some experience with this type of thing. Either personal experience or maybe second-hand experience. So if any of you are watching, I'm gonna ask you, what did you think of the message here? Did you feel any impact from it? Either positively or negatively, or were you just indifferent to it? I'm genuinely curious. For me though, regardless of the ending, this episode was again mostly mediocre, and certainly nowhere near funny enough. Episode 14, Family Guy Light. Peter is unable to climb the stairs at work, causing him to go on a health kick. Meanwhile, Brian reads a romance novel Lois wrote, and thinks she is having an affair. My best cutaway, it was free, like a recently divorced man with no kids. And best moment was Jace telling Peter how bad pizza is for him. I gave this one a 2 out of 5. So Lois writing this book as a fantasy about, I quote, being dominated by this special needs guy and his idiot strength already puts us on shaky ground from a likability perspective, and Brian only adds to that by trying to seduce Lois based on reading her book without her knowing. The scene with him and the horse was very cringy stuff. The only good thing about this was Lois calling Brian out on his hypocrisy, how he's okay with trying to get Lois himself, but doesn't want her having an affair with anyone else. But again, Lois wasn't much better herself, so this isn't much of a positive really. The subplot worked slightly better. Peter losing weight was not taken seriously. He literally goes to eat fast food during his workout. But despite all this, he still ends up becoming skinny anyway, because Quagmire trapped him in his basement. He stays skinny too at the end of the episode. Not like it's going to last beyond this episode, but still. The main reason I like the subplot better is it actually had some decent jokes. Like the whole thing about Peter having Skittles in him, and Quagmire's house being tricked up to respond to certain phrases like, "Can I stay the night?" My favourite of all though was Jay's with a J, and his arrogant yet at the same time uninformed lecture of Peter about how bad pizza is. Peter going, "It's clear you're an idiot and deserve no more of my time," is exactly the right way to respond to those type of people. Episode 15. No giggity, no doubt. Quagmire discovers a long-lost daughter and becomes obsessive about her. My best cutaway here was Peter driving the very small Fiat. And best moment was Quagmire teaching Courtney to fly the plane. This one gets a 3 out of 5. This was okay. God knows how many kids Quagmire has at this point, but here they at least try to make something more of it. The way Quagmire found out Courtney was his daughter was quite funny, what with the emergency DNA test, and the fact that she too says giggity. Him becoming a super obsessive, overbearing father was typical of Quagmire too, even if it was a touch annoying. My favourite moments here did come from Quagmire bonding with Courtney, like them manoeuvring the plane upside down next to the other plane, and Quagmire cheering her on at athletics. The way he climbs down the seats to lecture the judges was a decent gag. The ending to Act 3, with them all getting lost in the forest and a fire breaking out, was a very rushed, unoriginal conflict though, and Peter and Meg had no reason to be there at all. Still, this was a decent episode, and even though Courtney didn't have much personality here, it would still be interesting for her to stick around on the show. Is that going to happen though? Probably not. Episode 16. You Can't Handle the Booth. The Family Guy characters sit down to do a DVD commentary for one of their episodes. My best cutaway here was the family stuck in the real game of Trouble, and best moment was the characters talking to the real life people who voice them. This one gets a 2 out of 5. One bit of credit I do have to give this episode is it does capture the vibe of DVD commentaries, with the banter between the people doing the commentary and the interjecting at random points to share personal anecdotes about the production of the episode, or just to comment on a joke that's happening on screen. In general, it's just a unique idea to have the actual Family Guy characters in a booth providing commentary over their own adventures. That being said, large chunks of this episode were not entertaining. Partly because there was this separate episode going on in the background. It was honestly a bit confusing and hard for me to focus on what they wanted me to focus on. Like, should I concentrate on the visuals on screen? Or the characters arguing about their pay and marriage problems? Either way, it was not that funny. The ending bit went real meta, and had the actual voice actors come in to chat with the characters and tell them to chill out because they are not actually real. This was okay, especially the bit of Seth going over why all their lives are actually better than if they were real people, apart from Meg of course. Still, while I somewhat respect this episode, the hard reality is, the majority of it was not entertaining. Episode 17, Island Adventure. Stewie and Brian set out to recover Stewie's tricycle after Peter throws it away. Meanwhile, Lois helps Quagmire to hook up with a middle-aged woman. My best cutaway here was Stewie working a part-time job at the weird Target Pizza Hut. And best moment was Stewie and Brian meeting the people living on the garbage island. This one gets a 3 out of 5. It was close to a 4, but as is often the case with this season, there were a few weird choices which held it back. For example, Lois helping Quagmire to pick up middle-aged women was interesting, and not something we've seen much of, if at all, before. It also allowed them to get some shots in at those type of women, be them stereotypes or not. Still, the ending was fairly dull, and included a pointless scene with Lois shopping at Target for some reason. And to be honest, it's not really clear why Lois had that much of a problem with Quagmire sleeping around anyway. Stewie and Brian going on the hunt for the North Atlantic garbage patch was quite engaging. Their boat sinking was a bit predictable, but the idea of a bunch of people vibing on the garbage patch is something I can get behind. Well, in the show at least. Having all your food be other people's rubbish doesn't seem so great to me. It's a perfect fit for Brian though, so it's understandable he wants to stay. By the way, Brian rubbing in the garbage like a dog a few times in the episode was quite funny. So was him and Stewie trying to explain to everyone what they missed out on in the past 20 years. The ending again felt a bit rushed. Stewie used all the Dell laptop fans to somehow bring the garbage pile to shore in Quahog. It was nice of him to tell Brian he was a big part of his life, too big a part to lose, but still, it's not like Brian or any of the other people had any choice but to come back to land after all. Episode 18, Throw It Away. Lois buys Trisha Tuckernower's new book and becomes obsessed with decluttering. Peter's version of Imagine was my favourite cutaway, and favourite moment was Lois finding Stewie's time machine and getting mad at the family. This one gets a 4 out of 5. This had its flaws. Lois was maybe a bit much at times, and once she decluttered everything, so the whole house was bare, it was hard to go anywhere from there. That's why the ending where the family mistakenly thought she was going to kill herself felt a bit rushed, and never had the impact it should have. Almost like the writers wrote themselves into a bit of a corner. Still, as the rating suggests, I do think the positives here outweigh those flaws. I do typically like it when Lois goes a bit crazy. She definitely has that unstable side to her. It actually works better when they go super over the top with it. Like when she drags Stewie's time machine down the stairs and makes Chris, 1930s work whistle angry. When it's more sedate and personal is when it becomes a bit unlikable. Here there were a number of good moments which stem from Lois's actions, like Peter sleeping in the storage place, and Stewie saying, "How about a clear path to dinner, bitch?" after her whole spiel about wanting a clear path to happiness. Peter using the bare white room to give his cover of Imagine was definitely one of my favourites, mainly because they took the piss out of the song, and I'm not a fan of the song really. Not only is the melody very drab and depressing, lyrically it's very simplistic. Sure, some of it is theoretically good, like no hunger, people getting along with each other, etc. But some of it makes no sense, especially the bit about no possessions. Like, how would that even work in a functional human society? Anyway, enough about that song. As far as this episode is concerned, it was some much needed entertainment after a very drab spell. Episode 19, Girl Interneted. Meg finds internet fame from a show where she eats everything she finds. However, the unhealthy lifestyle catches up with her. Also, Brian starts to drive a Hummer. There were no cutaways here, so that's easy enough. But my best moment was Peter's Instagram story of being kicked out of the convention. This one gets a 3 out of 5. This was decent for the most part. Some of the takes on internet and streamer culture were fairly accurate, and of course they point out how sometimes harmful things are promoted, like Meg's unhealthy lifestyle. I especially enjoyed Peter putting up on Instagram how he got kicked out. That is exactly the type of attention-seeking behaviour people do put out on social media. Now, the bits of Meg developing type 2 diabetes were not great, especially with her gross feet. And the ending where she denounces her unhealthy lifestyle was very predictable. Although I will confess, I laughed at Dr. Hartman's line about how Meg's type of diabetes is the one you're supposed to shame her about, not feel sorry for her. The subplot was short, simple, but still okay for what it was. Brian driving the Hummer was somewhat entertaining by itself, and it was very fitting how the only thing the radio played was rock songs by Kiss. Episode 20, Adam West High. Brian and Quagmire face off in Quahog's mayoral election to see who replaces Mayor West. My best cutaway was Peter's tribute to Mayor Adam West. And best moment, which was kind of related, was the Batman version of the closing theme. The season finale gets a 3 out of 5. Much like the last few episodes, there were some good ideas mixed in with some weird ones. It was a bit odd, they waited so long to make somewhat of a tribute to Adam West, but it's definitely better late than never. He was such a legend, not only for this show but for all his acting work, and he seemed like a nice, fun-loving guy, so he will definitely be missed. The school being renamed after him was kind of a nice touch, but maybe they partly did it to take a shot at James Woods. Brian running to replace Mayor West was a bit lackluster, but I'm just glad they never turned this into another political episode, which they hinted at. The last thing we need is me going on another rant. Stewie's short responses to Brian asking for his encouragement to run was probably my favourite joke of the episode. How blunt he is about not giving Brian his support. So there's that. What else is there? Quagmire and Brian getting trapped on the bus never really came to anything. I think it's clear by now. Those two will never make up. So their bickering is kind of pointless. Maybe if they made an entire episode dedicated to having them stranded together and went deep into it, it could work. But here it was just kind of tacked on to the Mayor storyline. You know, the more I think about it, the more it feels like these two plot points would work better as separate episodes. But alas, that's not what we got. Anyway, that's a wrap for the season, guys. Let's move on to the Family Guy Season 17 summary. The overall average score regressed back down to a 2.75. My bottom 5 episodes were You Can't Handle a Booth at 5, Family Guy Light at 4, Trans Fat at 3, Trump Guy at 2, and Con Harris at 1. My mediocre top 5 episodes, which includes one 3 out of 5, were Island Adventure at 5, Throw It Away at 4, Regarding Carter at 3, Pawtucket Pete at 2, and Big Trouble in Little Quahog was the best of the year. So after the very experimental and slightly improved Season 16, this one regressed back to the standard, modern, mundane mediocrity. The 3 M's which seem to sum up Family Guy these days. This is also one of those seasons which was not even bad in an interesting way, which is the kind of season I dread, especially as someone who does these reviews. It means in addition to the episodes being a bit of a slog, I also don't have much to talk about, either in regards to the characters or the stories themselves. If you found something, anything which stands out about this season, please share in the comments because I'm kind of stumped. Truly, regardless of the season in question, I always appreciate your guys' interaction and feedback. For now though, I'll sign off for this season and eventually gather myself for the next one. Take care everybody.